Welcome to No Rules Berlin. This is episode number 7 already, the first easy peasy Sunday session. Our coffees are already brewed and we're still rolling without a script because, as we say in media, we can fix that in post. And today we will talk about OnDeck, the place where ambitious people will get together and grow. And today's episode is a special because we have a guest, our dear friend Mark. Mark and Chris were part of the founding team at the former startup HackerBay. So first of all, welcome, Mark. And why don't you say a few words about yourself?
Hey, Aljoy. Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so as the founding CTO of HackerBay, and currently I'm leading a team in Munich at Intel to help startups, post-seed startups grow. And in my nights and weekends, I spend a lot of time with open source projects and basically helping them achieve a sustainable business or path to business.
All right, great.
Happy to be
cool.
here.
Welcome. So, Chris, also welcome to you. Let's start, Chris, the conversation on OnDeck. Tell us what is it about, who is it for?
Yeah, sure. And I'm doing the bullish case today. So I'm over-promising. There was the Thiel Fellowship a few years ago. And the Thiel Fellowship was this thing by Peter Thiel where he gave young students $100,000 to drop out of university and start a business. And I guess the most famous Thiel Fellows today that I know are the founder of Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, and then also people like Dylan, the CEO of Figma. And the Thiel Fellowship was a fundamentally great idea. There was just two things. Number one, it was probably too early because back then people still believed in universities and it's smart to take a loan and go into debt and have this like credentials. And number two is it didn't scale well because even for Peter Thiel, paying $100,000 per student every time a new student comes around, that was pretty expensive. And so OnDeck is officially called the OnDeck Fellowship. And actually it's the 2.0 of the Thiel Fellowship. And instead of getting $100,000 at OnDeck, you have to pay for the fellowship. So it starts roughly at 2,000 and goes up to 10,000 for certain fellowships. And the big vision of OnDeck is that with this fellowship, you're actually building like a new Stanford, a new university, but instead of a campus, you have the internet. Instead of a real estate play, you are a pure online play, a technology company with technology margins, and you can scale ad absurdum because today most of those universities can't really scale because, well, you only have so much space in a lecture room. And that's the big picture of OnDeck, and calling themselves the Stanford in the cloud. That's why I'm personally very excited about.
Okay, and so how does this work? What's the experience like? Like it's, I think, a certain duration. I don't know, is it 3-6 months or whatever? How does it work? Like you are just paying the money and you get accepted, or how does that work? Is there any process of that you have to qualify there in order to get in? I heard great things about the network, but so is there some type of qualification basically before you can even like drop the money and be part of it?
Yeah, let me start like full funnel. So OnDeck is basically acquiring users virally on Twitter. So if you look at the employees at OnDeck, most of them have a huge following on Twitter. So if it's Eric Torenberg, so former people at Product Hunt, so all of them are like there is this joke that in order to be part of the OnDeck team, you should have at least 10,000 followers on Twitter. And so what they have is a lot of reach. I'm pretty sure it goes into the hundreds of millions impressions a month in the entire team, if you combine the entire impressions. Then they have an application funnel. So you can't be part of OnDeck by just paying money. You have to apply. And this application process is for certain programs. And one fun fact is I first applied to the founder fellowship and didn't get in because they said you don't qualify as the founder we're looking for. So, and then I applied for the no-code fellowship and I got in instantly because people, you're a real contributor to no-code. And we see that with your background, you fit exactly in one of the 4 categories we have scoped beforehand. And so, for example, I'm a software developer turned no-coder, and that was one of the key categories they wanted to fill. So then you have the application. When you get accepted, you have to pay, and then you have an 8-week program. And this 8-week program is basically like a buffet where it's all virtual. Every day you have Zoom sessions with all the other people, and you can choose what you want to be part of. And those 8 weeks, they are basically the onboarding towards a long-term alumni network, because of course you now have the OnDeck directory, I have the OnDeck Slack, and because of Twitter, because a lot of stuff is happening on Twitter, you're fully connected on certain lists, direct messages with people you're constantly interacting. And so it's basically this long-term fellowships. And now that was all online, and now I don't even know if it's announced yet. That's the beauty with Colin. We can, of course, take it out later. We now have those in real life events. So, of course, OnDeck started online during the pandemic to really scale up, but now they're like doing those in real life events. And I'm the chapter captain for Berlin. So I'm the person who is running Berlin now as a volunteer. And we're going to organize in real life events that are going across the different fellowships. So we connect the climate tech founders with the no coders, with the designers, with the freelancers, with the founders, with the angels, whatever. And you basically now have those alumni networks across, I guess it's 12 cities so far, where it's really interesting how the network effects are playing out. And maybe one last sentence, what I find super stunning, the branding on Twitter and this alumni network of great people that they have built so far, you can really see how it gets traction, because I'm getting every week 2 to 3 calls from venture capitalists in Berlin, and they're like, hey, can I have access to the database of OnDeck in Berlin? And I'm like, of course not. And that's not how it works. But you really see how there's like such a pull, and they manage to build all of that online.
That's great. I think the fact that they emphasize on the network and that these 8 weeks are just an onboarding process, that's like the smart part, because what you actually want is not, and you can't even like do all the things that you have to learn in 8 weeks, all these other programs that you typically see, hey, pay this amount of money for 3 months and we get you on course and what have you within that 3 months, and that's it. And then afterwards you just make a cut or whatever. That doesn't work. What you actually want is this educational thing, of course, but also access to a network with like-minded people that actually, where you can try out your thoughts and have some deep conversations about these things. And that's like even more valuable, I would say, than actually this a few courses that you do and expect to be like supercharged or whatever. But it's actually the network, that have people in your network that you can try out these ideas or have some exchange or get the missing link or close the gap to certain things. That's, I think, what the valuable thing is, and that they set up for that. That's the ramp up process, let's say, in these 8 weeks. I think that's the smart bit there.
Yeah, and also what is really interesting with those network effects products, and we had this other episode about network effects capitalism. That's why it's so funny that Mark is there. Those network effects products, you have to be very early to get in, because the moment those things get traction and people get more successful, it's getting harder and harder. And so if you look at the Y Combinator, it was pretty easy to get in back in 2008 if you knew that it existed. But of course, today there's 20,000 applications for every cohort. And so it's way harder to get in. And I guess I'm one of the very few people that saw OnDeck pretty early, especially being international. And it goes back to this story with Mark together when we were walking around at the Stanford campus back then when we lived in San Francisco. And I guess, Mark, it's funny to tell the story. I guess you have those 2 things with OnDeck, and that's why you're here today as a guest. One, because you had the vision for OnDeck. You're one of those people who had the idea back then, and we can prove it on a Facebook Live video. But also then later, it's interesting because you had some certain contacts with OnDeck.
Yeah, I think that's a great transition. We did have that idea like back then when we were at Stanford, and that's why it's, I think, double as funny that OnDeck calls themselves Stanford in the cloud or Stanford of the internet, just because Stanford is such a well-known academy of great founders within San Francisco, within Silicon Valley, but also obviously known across the world, at least in the startup circles. And when we walked across the campus, what was really interesting was that you have tons of students studying on the lawns, and there were so many buildings. And these buildings, of course, the Stanford campus is quite large, but it has a finite size. It cannot grow as large as the US, for example. And just having that physical limitation, what Christian also mentioned at the beginning, doesn't allow Stanford to go above a certain amount of students per year, for example. And there were different experiments actually at Stanford where they wanted to cut down that semester into trimester and shorten the whole academic life cycle of 4 years into 3 years and just have a higher intake of students. But I guess that A/B test never took off. At least we're still stuck with this semester by 4 years term, and it's just too long. And the other part that Chris mentioned is that now that I'm working with a lot of open source projects, I actually applied to OnDeck in the beginning of January as a joke, but half serious as well, that I wanted to run a program that didn't exist yet. I wanted to run the open source software fellowship or open source fellowship, what I called it. And I basically pitched them a brand new program which didn't exist. And I took a look on their programs websites where they had like a bunch of creator programs, career programs, sector programs. And the open source program was an amalgamation or kind of a mix of communities creator program, the no code program, and an unreleased engineering program. And yeah, so I had a couple of interviews with them and I actually pitched them my idea. They really liked it. We have not made yet any announcements, so I can't say much more about that yet. But definitely, I'm still working on this together also with OnDeck. But what's really interesting is the network effects built into the different programs or this ecosystem of OnDeck. It's that one fellowship supports other fellowships. It's not a standalone program. And Olja, you said it as well. It's a network. And while each individual fellowship produces a certain number of trained individuals, they can then interact with other fellowships or intersect with other fellowships and either be in a supporting role, in a co-founding role, or a customer even. And I think this is the great aspect of OnDeck, where it turns into a market network. Having to define what a market network is, I guess Chris can do that. But yeah, that's what I like. And I think the open source fellowship, that's what's intriguing about it. It's like I pitched it as building the backbone of the internet in 8 weeks and getting more people into open source and training them. And yeah, looking forward what will happen.
There was so much input. Let's try to, like, you have more spots on the show, so I guess you put it all in one take. Like, that was so. Let's start maybe again because it's so fascinating. And I guess the open source fellowship is the one that's the most interesting. Like, when you said the idea, hey, I think there should be an open source fellowship. And I remember, and I guess it's very interesting also from the inside at OnDeck, seeing it. OnDeck focuses on programs that traditional universities don't really offer yet. And so if you look at their site, so where do you go today? What's the Stanford for no code? What's the Stanford for customer success? What's the Stanford for open source? And that's where, whenever you look at those programs, you end up at OnDeck, because it seems like they're too new, those programs, and no traditional university yet had this like really pragmatic but also focused community around those topics. And I guess going quickly to the open source, like how did you come up with this idea that open source should be an OnDeck fellow?
Great question. Yeah, I think this whole idea of specialization or individualization is taking more shape in our generation and the generation to follow. When I was working with open source projects, one thing that stood out is that you typically have, a few projects, or you have a lot of open source projects, and depending on which ecosystem you go into, whether it's in JavaScript, whether it's in cloud functions, you have lots and lots of open source projects, and they vary in size. But what's pretty much always the same is that the open source projects are run by a handful or very few maintainers and a bit more contributors. So maintainers are basically you could think about it as the founders of a project. And they have, obviously, it was their idea, it was the most incentive, but also maintainers can switch over time. Maybe they get burned out, and then someone that has been contributing for a very long time, maybe a key employee, for example, in a startup perspective, would take over as a maintainer, as a full-time job. And so you have these maintainers and contributors, and then you have the users of that project. And the users typically outnumber the amount of contributors and maintainers. And it's very similar to any company, because if you start a startup, you're typically, maybe you're a 3-person team who starts a company, and then you get some employees, and maybe you reach 100 employees, maybe you reach more. But ideally, you will always, at least if you're a consumer product, you will have like thousands, 100,000s, millions of users. So your users always outnumber you. However, as a startup, you get paid. As an open source maintainer, you don't get paid from your users, because open source is that you inherently want to share your knowledge and give something to the world so that they can build on top of it. And I always wanted to figure out what's the better way for maintainers to earn their fair salary or earn their fair share. And that's why I wanted this open source fellowship to exist, not only to bring in more individuals into open source as to either help out the current maintainers or just in general start more projects in that space, but also have a community of like-minded people to really explore that idea. What are really the important things for open source projects? How would they want to get paid? And use it as a large, hive mind of these individuals who then would come up with the ideas themselves. That's the idea behind it.
You two have much more hands-on experience on OnDeck, but for me, as someone from outside and just seeing these bits here and there, it looks like OnDeck is like network first designed. Whereas if you look at traditional education like Stanford, it's not like there's some network element to it, but it's like very lock in. Like you have to pay a huge amount of money to get into the exclusive club of being at Stanford, and then afterwards there might be some alumni thing or whatever, but it's not like it's not their duty anymore once you leave Stanford to do anything for you. While as with OnDeck, you actually are getting positioned to function and elevate in that network. And it seems like the only reason why these 8 weeks exist and that little payment, let's say, is just to ensure that with the addition of new nodes to that network, you're not harming the entire the functioning of the network of OnDeck. It seems to be like totally different position, but positioned the right way, I think, because as they add more people to that network and ensure that the nodes that are coming in are healthy and functioning well and contributing, it just scales crazy, and everyone benefits from being added to the node, but also for the others to have additional fellows or nodes in that network.
And going back to the there's two things, like really analyzing when you call yourself Stanford in the cloud. I guess the cloud part, that it's online based, that's pretty easy. So let's talk about Stanford. And is it really comparable to Stanford? And the number one thing is Stanford is so famous, especially in tech circles, because most big companies in the last 20 years were founded 20 miles around Stanford campus. And if you look at Google, Sun Microsystems, Snapchat, so many people were at Stanford, and it was really this thing when venture capitalists were saying, hey, actually, why should I be in Austin, or why should I be in New York, or why should I be in Berlin? And most venture returns, I guess it's 96%, were created around Stanford campus. Look like a hawk to find the next Stanford student to invest in. And I should not spend my time anywhere else. That was like the last 20 years. And so I guess that's number one. Like when you call yourself Stanford 10 years from now, OnDeck needs to be, let's say, 50% of all venture returns should be created by OnDeck fellows. That would be my number one metric I would track. And if you look on the website of OnDeck, they are doing that. They say, hey, OnDeck fellows founded so much money, raised so much money from VCs. And I guess it's now, so far, it's 250 million or something like that. And the second part is Stanford costs, let's say, $200,000. OnDeck costs 100 times less. So it's $2,000. And so I guess it's very important that whenever you look at internet disruptive business models, you can clearly pinpoint down, hey, it's 10 times cheaper, 100 times cheaper. This time it's 100 times cheaper to get the same. Like that's the idea. The third one is, how big is Stanford? You look at the students, and Stanford has, let's say, with all alumni, let's just say it's 100,000 people, or like 500,000, let's say 1 million. Could OnDeck scale to 100 million people? Question mark. But the internet is 4 billion people, so actually it's possible to really scale 100 times, or at least 10 times bigger than Stanford. And when talking about Stanford, I guess, Mark, also for you, I remember when we were walking around the campus and we were talking about, hey, how could this Stanford in the internet look like? I guess what I learned the hard way now is your best ideas. All of the ideas I have now in startup land were created around that time when we were roughly 24, 25 years old. And it just takes then still 10 years to get to this point. But it's so fascinating that we had this one idea with Stanford and the other idea that software development should change. And we're still on the software development, we're still working on. So you more on the open source, I'm on the no code side, but it feels like that you don't have so many great ideas in life and you should stick to them. So how do you think about Stanford and
Yeah, I think that's very true. You only get like one or two good ideas in your 20s, but until you realize that it's a good idea, either you're like exceptional and you can execute on that quite early on, and you have the perseverance to stick it through for 10 years, or it takes you 10 years to realize, okay, that was a great idea, and now it's like playing catch up. But yeah, I think also if you compare like OnDeck and Stanford, I think your metrics are completely true. How many, at least from the point of view of the venture capitalists or from the founders, I think those are the numbers that really matter. And of course, you have to take into account inflation and stuff, but that's like the details. But what I was always thinking is, okay, what else does Stanford have? Stanford has courses and studies and certain specializations. And okay, you recreated that in OnDeck, and you created probably a better network than in Stanford because everyone's like in this same mindset. And what else does Stanford have, or a university of that size? And there are like career services, for example. There are very basic, like they're dorms or places where you can meet up physically. And I think you mentioned that earlier, that they have these programs now also in person, where they started actually in person with OnDeck, but now they're going back to in person as well. And you could think of, for anyone else who's not in the OnDeck ecosystem but wants to participate from either the fellowships that are continuously growing or the network effects that are happening at OnDeck, think about what kind of external services are required for such a university to sustain, or I already call it a university, for such a network to sustain, and something that is not maybe their specialty. What is a function that they would outsource, and that could make you as a startup money, or as an individual could make you money, but it's not a core service of the OnDeck offering. And that's something I'm thinking about also.
One thing that also I was wondering about, Chris, can you give us like maybe the VC's point of view on OnDeck? I know there's many VCs investing in OnDeck companies and what have you, but can you give us like your perspective on that, on these programs?
Yeah, sure. Here's the secret to the initial network. Like whenever you start such a network product, you really have to have a secret. Who are the first 1,000 users? And what OnDeck nailed it, is they were looking for amazing product people, amazing people at the top Silicon Valley startups that are like, that we don't even know their names. Third row, fourth row, product manager at Airbnb, at Stripe, at Zoom, at whatever. And they were telling them, hey, look, what is if we have a fellowship among people when they are actually wondering, should I start my own business at one point of time? And it was secretive because, of course, when you were working at Stripe and you did a great job as a product manager, you don't want that it's public on the internet that actually you want to start a company one day and that you actually don't have a co-founder. And they initially targeted this very unique supply of founders. So prior really good experience at one of the top tech companies in the world. Then the fear, they had this massive fear of opportunity cost. So when you're a product manager at Stripe and this thing is growing continuously, why should you leave and start your own company? How do you find a co-founder? Are you actually good enough to be a founder, or are you a great product manager but not a founder? And so they targeted, with their initial dinner series and other stuff, they targeted exactly those group of people that are very rare and extremely valuable to VCs the moment they start the companies, because there's thousands and 10,000s of those people. And that was the unique initial supply. And if you now look at the numbers of OnDeck, and I once again, I have to see later if I can share that or not, but there's roughly 1,500 people in San Francisco. There's, I don't know, like 500 in LA. And for example, the Berlin chapter is 10 people, let's say it that way. And so they have this unique supply of fellows. But those fellows, of course, then over the course of years created amazing companies that then were amazing deal flow for those VCs. And now every VC kind of has a FOMO, because you got this machinery working that when you're part of OnDeck, you're probably onto something bigger. So at least I should take the meeting. And that's what they got exactly. And so what I see from the venture side, at least now, it's like, whenever you have OnDeck, and that's so important for network effects products, like whenever you have OnDeck in your LinkedIn or Twitter, of course you have more reach towards those people, and the conversion rate goes up, that they take the meeting or that you get the intro. And of course, if an OnDeck fellow they invested in makes you the intro to the VC, of course, it's also instant trust. And that's where I think it's very similar towards those networks when if you worked at Google or if you were at Stanford, now you have a very similar bound, and they exactly nailed the initial early adopters of those networks.
All right, thank you for that from your point of view. We've been talking now over half an hour to you two. Thank you, Mark, for joining us